always thought my life was perfect, not in a naive fairy tale kind of way, but in the way that everything seemed to fall into place just as it should. I had a loving family, a sister I thought I could trust, and a fiancé who made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. But perfection is a fragile thing, and mine shattered in the most brutal way possible. My name is Elena, and this is the story of how I lost everything, only to find myself in the wreckage. The morning of my wedding day started like any other. The sun streamed through the curtains of my childhood bedroom, casting a golden glow over the room. I sat at the vanity, staring at my reflection, trying to process that this was the day. My hair was curled to perfection, my makeup flawless, and my dress, a stunning A-line gown with delicate lace detailing, hung on the door, waiting for me to step into it. I felt like a princess, and why shouldn't I? I was about to marry the man of my dreams. My sister Clara was supposed to be there with me. She was my maid of honor after all, but she hadn't shown up yet. I tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I shrugged it off, assuming she was running late. Clara was always a little scatterbrained, but she had a heart of gold. At least, that's what I thought. My mother came into the room, her eyes glistening with tears as she looked at me. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. I smiled, but something about her expression felt off. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and there was a tension in her shoulders that I couldn't ignore. "Mum, are you okay?" I asked, reaching for her hand. She hesitated, then forced a brighter smile. "Of course, darling. It's just emotional. My little girl is getting married." I nodded, accepting her explanation, but the unease lingered. My father was unusually quiet during breakfast, barely making eye contact with me. My younger brother Jake kept fidgeting with his tie, his usual playful demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic seriousness. I chalked it up to wedding day nerves. After all, this was a big day for all of us. The ceremony was set for 2 p.m. at St. Michael's Cathedral, a grand, historic church that had been in our family for generations. By 1:30 p.m., I was dressed and ready, but Clara still hadn't arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from my fiancé, Daniel. "Daniel. Can't wait to see you, Elena. Today's the start of forever." I smiled, my heart fluttering. Daniel had always been my rock. We'd been together for 5 years, and he'd never given me a reason to doubt him. He was kind, ambitious, and ridiculously handsome. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. At 1:45 p.m., my phone rang. It was Clara. "Where are you?" I demanded, half relieved, half frustrated. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "There's been an emergency. I can't make it to the wedding." "What? Clara, this is my wedding day. What could possibly be more important?" She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought I heard someone whispering in the background. I can't explain right now. I'm so sorry. I love you." Before I could respond, she hung up. I stared at my phone, my stomach churning. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. By 2:15 p.m., the guests were seated, the music was playing, and I was standing at the back of the church, clutching my bouquet. My heart pounded as I waited for my cue to walk down the aisle, but Daniel wasn't there. The officiant approached me, his face pale. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry, but Daniel isn't here." "What do you mean he isn't here?" I asked, my voice rising. "He's the groom." The guests began to murmur, their whispers growing louder. My parents exchanged a glance, their faces filled with guilt. And then it hit me, the way my mother had looked at me that morning, the way my father couldn't meet my eyes, the way Clara had sounded on the phone. They knew something they hadn't told me. "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice shaking. My mother stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Elena, I'm so sorry. Daniel, he's not coming." "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "This isn't funny." "He's marrying Clara," my father said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, my vision blurring. What? Number, that's impossible. Daniel wouldn't. But even as I said it, the pieces began to fall into place. Clara's sudden distance over the past few months, Daniel's late-night work meetings, the way they'd always seemed a little too close, a little too comfortable with each other. I'd ignored the signs, convinced myself I was being paranoid, but now the truth was staring me in the face. "They're getting married today," my mother said, her voice breaking. "At the Riverside Chapel. We didn't know how to tell you." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My sister, my fiancé, my own family. They all betrayed me. I didn't remember leaving the church. I didn't remember driving to the Riverside Chapel. All I remember is standing in the back of the room, watching as Daniel and Clara exchanged vows. She wore a white dress, just like mine. He looked at her the way he used to look at me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the room apart, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as my world crumbled around me. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, I overheard a conversation between two guests. "Can you believe it? Clara and Daniel were meant to be together from the start." "I know, right?" It's such a shame about Eleanor, though. She never really fit in with the family anyway. "Well, she is adopted. Maybe it's for the best." Adopted. The word echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. I felt like I'd been sucker punched. My knees buckled, and I barely made it to a chair before I collapsed. Adopted. All these years and no one had told me. My parents, the people I'd trusted most in the world, had kept this from me. And now my sister, my real sister, had stolen the man I loved. That night I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been the happiest day of my life. My dress was crumpled on the floor, my makeup smeared from hours of crying. But beneath the grief and the anger, something else was stirring, something dark and dangerous. This wasn't the end, this was just the beginning. The days after the wedding blurred together in a haze of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. I didn't leave my apartment, I didn't answer my phone, I barely ate. The world outside felt like a distant, hostile place, and I couldn't bring myself to face it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara in that white dress, Daniel slipping the ring onto her finger, and the look of guilt on my parents' faces. The images played on a loop, tormenting me. But the worst part was the question that kept gnawing at me. Why? Why had Clara done this? Why had Daniel betrayed me? And why had my parents kept the truth about my adoption from me? I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by hiding in my apartment. On the fourth day, I finally worked up the courage to confront my parents. I drove to their house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I walked through the front door, they were sitting in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. They looked like they hadn't slept in days. "Eleanor," my mother said, standing up quickly, "we've been so worried about you." "Worried about me," I snapped, my voice trembling with anger. "You knew about Daniel and Clara, and you didn't tell me. You let me walk into that church like an idiot, thinking my life was perfect. How could you do that to me?" My father stood up, his expression pained. "We didn't know how to tell you, Elena. We thought it would be better if you heard it from them." "Better for who? Certainly not for me," I shouted, my voice breaking. "And what about the other secret you've been keeping from me, the fact that I'm adopted?" My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father looked away, his shoulders slumping. The silence that followed was deafening. "How long were you going to keep that from me?" I demanded, tears streaming down my face. "Were you ever going to tell me?" "We were going to tell you," my mother said softly. We didn't know how. We were afraid of how you'd react." "Afraid of how I'd react?" I repeated, incredulous. "Do you have any idea how betrayed I feel right now? My entire life has been a lie." "Elena, please," my father said, stepping forward. "We love you. You're our daughter no matter what. We didn't tell you because we didn't want you to feel like you didn't belong." Well, guess what? I said bitterly. I don't belong, not in this family, not after what Clara and Daniel did, and not after what you've kept from me. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into uncovering the truth about my adoption. I needed to know where I came from, who I really was. It felt like the only thing I could control in a world that had spiraled out of control. I started by going through my parents' old files and documents. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, a folder labeled Elena's Adoption. My hands shook as I opened it and began to read. I was born in a small town about 2 hours away. My biological mother was young, only 17, and unmarried. She'd given me up for adoption shortly after I was born. There was no information about my biological father. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. I'd always felt like I didn't quite fit in with my family, but I'd never known why. Now it all made sense. I wasn't just the black sheep, I wasn't even part of the flock. I decided to track down my biological mother. It wasn't easy. She'd moved several times over the years, but eventually I found her. Her name was Maria, and she lived in a modest apartment in the city. When I knocked on her door, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would she be happy to see me? Angry? Indifferent? The door opened, and a woman who looked eerily like me stood there, her eyes wide with shock. "Elena," she whispered. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We spent hours talking that day. She told me about her life, about the circumstances that led to her giving me up, and about how she'd always wondered what had happened to me. She apologized over and over for not being there for me, and I forgave her. She wasn't the one who had betrayed me. As I got to know Maria, I began to feel a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was a survivor, and I wasn't going to let Clara and Daniel get away with what they'd done. I started to formulate a plan. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my power. I wanted them to feel the same pain they'd inflicted on me. I wanted them to know what it felt like to have their world ripped out from under them. But I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. This wasn't just about hurting them. It was about exposing the truth and holding them accountable. My first step was to gather information. I needed to know everything about Clara and Daniel's relationship, when it had started, how long it had been going on, and who else knew about it. I started by reaching out to mutual friends, pretending to be cordial and curious. Slowly, the pieces began to come together. I learned that Clara and Daniel had been seeing each other for over a year. They'd been sneaking around behind my back, meeting in secret, and lying to my face. Even worse, some of my so-called friends had known about it and hadn't said a word. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, but it also fueled my determination. I wasn't just going to expose them, I was going to destroy them. I decided to start small. I wrote a letter to Clara, detailing everything I knew about her affair with Daniel. I didn't hold back. I told her how much she'd hurt me, how much she'd betrayed me, and how I would never forgive her. I ended the letter with a warning. This is just the beginning. I sent the letter to her house, knowing Daniel would see it too. I wanted them to know I wasn't going to just disappear. I was going to fight back. As I waited for their reaction, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. Clara and Daniel were going to regret what they'd done. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of my revenge. The letter I sent to Clara was just the beginning. I knew it would rattle her, but I needed to see her reaction for myself. I needed to look her in the eye and watch her squirm. So I decided to pay her a visit. Clara and Daniel had moved into a cozy little house on the outskirts of town, a house they'd probably been planning to share long before my wedding day. I parked my car down the street and walked up to the front door, my heart pounding but my resolve steady. I knocked, and after a moment, Clara opened the door. Her face went pale when she saw me. "Elena," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my tone cold and steady. "Unless you'd rather have this conversation in front of Daniel." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. The house was exactly what I'd expected. Warm, inviting, and filled with little touches that screamed Clara. Photos of her and Daniel adorned the walls, and I felt a pang of anger as I realized how long this charade must have been going on. "Elena, Clara began, but I cut her off. "Save it," I snapped. "I didn't come here for your excuses. I came here to tell you that I know everything. I know about the affair. I know how long it's been going on. And I know that you've been lying to me for over a year." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. It just happened." "It just happened," I repeated, my voice rising. "You don't accidentally fall in love with your sister's fiancé, Clara. You don't accidentally plan a wedding behind her back. You knew exactly what you were doing." She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I know it doesn't make it right, but Daniel and I have a connection. We tried to fight it, but we couldn't." "A connection," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean the connection you built while I was planning my wedding? While I was picking out flowers and tasting cakes, you were sneaking around with the man I loved. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Clara didn't answer. She just stood there, her shoulders shaking as she cried. But I wasn't done. "And the adoption," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Did you know about that too? Did you and Mom and Dad sit around laughing about how I didn't even belong in this family?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "Elena, no, I didn't know about that until recently. Mom and Dad never told me either." "But you didn't tell me," I said, my voice breaking. "You let me believe I was part of this family, even as you were stabbing me in the back." Clara reached out to touch my arm, but I jerked away. "Don't," I said, my voice cold. "You don't get to play the victim here. You made your choice, Clara, and now you're going to live with the consequences." I left Clara's house that day with a fire burning in my chest. I'd seen the guilt in her eyes, the fear in her voice. She knew she'd messed up, and she knew I wasn't going to let her get away with it. But I wasn't done yet. I had a plan, and it was time to put it into action. My first move was to expose Clara and Daniel to the world. I created a fake social media account and began posting anonymous hints about their affair. I didn't name names at first, just vague, cryptic messages that would make people curious. Things like, "Isn't it funny how some people can smile to your face while stabbing you in the back?" Love is supposed to be sacred, but some people treat it like a game. The comments started rolling in almost immediately. People were intrigued, and it didn't take long for the rumors to start spreading. I watched from the shadows, my heart racing as I saw the seeds of doubt being planted. A few days later, I decided to confront Daniel. I knew he'd been avoiding me, but I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. I showed up at his office unannounced, and the look on his face when he saw me was priceless. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my tone icy. "Unless you'd rather have this conversation in front of your co-workers." He glanced around nervously, then gestured for me to follow him into a conference room. Once the door was closed, he turned to me, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "Eleanor, I know you're angry," he began, but I cut him off. "Angry doesn't even begin to cover it," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You betrayed me, Daniel. You lied to me. You made me believe you loved me, and all along you were sleeping with my sister." He had the decency to look ashamed, but it wasn't enough. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "Clara and we didn't plan for this to happen." "Stop saying that," I shouted, slamming my hand on the table. "You don't accidentally fall in love with someone, Daniel. You made a choice, and you chose to destroy me." He didn't respond. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes downcast. And in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't worth my tears. He wasn't worth my pain. He was just a coward who'd taken the easy way out. "You're going to regret this," I said, my voice low and steady. "You and Clara both. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did, and when I'm done, you're going to wish you'd never met me." I turned and walked out, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. Over the next few weeks, the rumors about Clara and Daniel's affair began to spread like wildfire. People started connecting the dots, and it wasn't long before their names were being dragged through the mud. I watched from the sidelines, my heart pounding with a mix of satisfaction and dread. Clara called me several times, begging me to stop. "Elena, please," she said during one particularly emotional conversation, "you're destroying our lives." "You destroyed mine first," I replied, my voice cold. "This is just the beginning, Clara. You and Daniel are going to pay for what you did." She hung up, and I knew I'd hit a nerve, but I wasn't done yet. I had more plans, more moves to make, and I wasn't going to stop until I'd taken everything from them, just like they'd taken everything from me. As I sat in my apartment that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was tempered by a newfound sense of purpose. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was a force to be reckoned with. The rumors about Clara and Daniel's affair had taken on a life of their own. Social media was ablaze with speculation, and their once pristine reputations were crumbling. I watched it all unfold with a mix of satisfaction and unease. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? For them to feel the same pain they'd inflicted on me. But as I scrolled through the comments, some sympathetic, others vicious, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was losing myself in the process. Still, I wasn't ready to stop, not yet. I decided to take things a step further. I created an anonymous blog detailing the story of a woman, betrayed by her sister and fiancé. I didn't use their names, but the details were specific enough that anyone who knew us would recognize them. I wrote about the lies, the deceit, and the emotional devastation. I poured my heart into every word, and the response was overwhelming. The blog went viral within days. People shared it, commented on it, and even reached out to me through the anonymous contact form to share their own stories of betrayal. It was cathartic in a way, but it also made me realize how many people had been hurt in similar ways. I wasn't alone, but that didn't make the pain any less real. Clara's life was unraveling. She called me again, her voice frantic. "Elena, please," she begged. "You have to stop. People are saying horrible things about me, about Daniel. This is getting out of control." "Out of control?" I repeated, my voice icy. "You mean like how you and Daniel got out of control behind my back?" "I know we hurt you," she said, her voice breaking, "and I'm so sorry, but this isn't you, Eleanor. You're not this person." Her words hit a nerve, but I pushed the doubt aside. "You don't get to decide who I am," I said, "not after what you did." She was silent for a moment, and then she said something that caught me off guard. "Do you really hate me that much?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't hate her. I hated what she'd done, but I still loved her. She was my sister, my best friend, the person I'd trusted most in the world. And that made the betrayal even harder to bear. Daniel wasn't faring much better. The scandal had reached his workplace, and his colleagues were starting to distance themselves from him. I heard through the grapevine that he'd been passed over for a promotion he'd been working toward for years. His reputation was in tatters, and I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. But then I ran into him at a coffee shop. He looked exhausted, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. When he saw me, he hesitated, then walked over. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet. "Can we talk?" I considered walking away, but curiosity got the better of me. "Talk," I said, crossing my arms. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, and I'll never be able to make that right. But what's happening now? It's destroying me, destroying Clara. Is that really what you want? I stared at him, my jaw clenched. You didn't seem to care about destroying me when you were sneaking around with my sister. I know, he said, his voice heavy with regret. And I'll never forgive myself for that. But this isn't justice, Eleanor. It's revenge, and it's eating you alive. His words struck a chord, but I wasn't ready to admit it. You don't get to lecture me about justice, I said, my voice trembling. You lost that right when you betrayed me. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. I just hope you find peace, Elena, for your sake. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked away, my heart pounding. As the days passed, the weight of what I was doing began to take its toll. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara's tear-streaked face and Daniel's exhausted expression. I told myself they deserved it, that they'd brought this on themselves. But deep down, I knew I was losing myself in the process. One night, I found myself standing outside Clara and Daniel's house. I didn't know why I was there. Maybe I wanted to see the damage I'd caused. Maybe I wanted to confront them one last time. Or maybe I just wanted to remind myself why I was doing this. I didn't knock. I just stood there, staring at the warm glow of the lights inside. And then I saw them, Clara and Daniel, sitting on the couch, their heads close together as they talked. They looked happy. Despite everything, they looked happy. It was like a punch to the gut. I turned and walked away, tears streaming down my face. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the blog I'd created. The comments were still pouring in, each one fueling the fire I'd started. But for the first time, I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt empty. I thought about Clara's question, "Do you really hate me that much?" And Daniel's words, "This isn't justice, Elena. It's revenge." They were right. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about hurting them the way they'd hurt me. And in the process, I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. I closed the blog and deleted it. It was time to stop. Not for them, but for me. The next morning, I called Maria, my biological mother. I needed to talk to someone who understood me, someone who wasn't tied to the mess I'd created. "Elena," she said when she answered, "is everything okay?" "No," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know who I am anymore." She listened as I poured out everything, the betrayal, the anger, the revenge. And when I was done, she said something that stayed with me. "You're not defined by what they did to you," she said. "You're defined by how you choose to move forward. You can let this destroy you, or you can use it to become stronger. The choice is yours." Her words gave me the clarity I needed. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could choose how to move forward. And I knew what I had to do. I reached out to Clara and Daniel, asking to meet them. It was time to end this, not with more pain, but with closure. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the past. This wasn't the end of my journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The cafe buzzed with midday chatter, but the air between us felt like a frozen wasteland. Clara sat across from me, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. Daniel lingered awkwardly by the door, unsure whether to join us. I'd asked them both to come, but now I wished I hadn't. Elena, cold, steady. "Sit down, Daniel. Let's get this over with." He obeyed, sliding into the booth beside Clara. Her eyes flicked to him, then back to me. The silence stretched until I broke it. "Eleanor, I don't even know where to start." "How about the truth? Not the half apologies or the excuses. Just why?" Daniel cleared his throat, his voice rough. "It wasn't planned. We didn't set out to hurt you. It just spiraled." "Spiraled? You proposed to me 6 months ago, Daniel. Were you already sleeping with her then?" Clara flinched. Daniel's jaw tightened. It started after your engagement party. We'd both been drinking and I was jealous. You had everything and I just wanted to feel wanted. So you stole my fiancé? You destroyed me to feel better about yourself? It wasn't like that. We tried to end it, but slamming her hand on the table. But what? You couldn't resist. You're pathetic, both of you. The cafe went quiet. A barista glanced over, concerned. I lowered my voice, sharp as a blade. I came here to tell you I'm done. Done with the lies, the games, the poison you've poured into my life, but don't think this is forgiveness. You don't get that. Clara reached for my hand. I jerked back. What can I do? Tell me how to fix this. Live with it. Live with what you've done, just like I have to live with it. I threw cash on the table and walked out, their voices chasing me into the street. My parents' house smelled like lavender and guilt. Mum answered the door, her eyes red-rimmed. Dad hovered in the hallway, a shadow of the man who'd walked me down the aisle. Elena, thank you for coming. I followed them to the living room, where childhood photos mocked me from the walls. The adoption papers sat on the coffee table, a silent confession. Elena, nodding at the papers, you kept these hidden for 28 years. We were scared. We thought if you knew, you'd leave. And now I'm leaving anyway. Funny, isn't it? Please don't. You're our daughter. We were wrong, but we love you. Why didn't you tell me about Clara and Daniel? You knew before the wedding. You let me stand there, humiliated. We thought they'd come clean. We thought if we pressured them, they'd ruin your day. We were trying to protect you. Protect me. You let me marry a man who was in love with my sister. You let me believe I was one of you. You are one of us. Biology doesn't matter. It does when you use it as a secret to control me. Silence, then softer. I need time. Maybe someday we can fix this, but not today. I left them standing there, the adoption papers crumpled in my fist. Maria opened the door in a robe, her hair messy from sleep. Eleanor, what's wrong? Holding out a notebook. I need to write a letter to myself. Will you help me? She brewed tea while I sat at her kitchen table, the words pouring out. Dear Eleanor, you're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to scream, to hate them, to want to burn their world down. But don't let them turn you into a ghost. Maria read over my shoulder, her hand warm on my back. Gentle. You're stronger than this, than them. Voice breaking. What if I'm not? What if I'm just broken? Firm. You're not broken, you're healing, and healing isn't pretty. I finished the letter and sealed it. Maria lit a candle, nodding at me to burn it. Hesitating. What if I need to remember the anger? Smiling sadly. Then keep the ashes, but don't carry the fire inside you anymore. The paper curled into smoke. For the first time in months, I breathed.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an amazing story.